千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together.
Here we are once again gathering to talk about the Daodejing. Chapter 36 is an interesting chapter with an unusual message, with Lao Tzu pointing out certain things that may not seem obvious at first, that may not seem intuitively obvious, but turn out to be very useful. So I want to dig into it right away and share the wisdom of Lao Tzu with you. Daodejing 36. If one wishes to shrink it, one must first expand it. If one wishes to weaken it, one must first strengthen it. If one wishes to discard it, one must first promote it. If one wishes to seize it, one must first give it. This is called subtle clarity. The soft and weak overcomes the tough and strong. Fish cannot leave the depths. The sharp instruments of the state cannot be shown to the people. So just a quick remark before we do our sectional analysis. It would be very usual for people to find a passage like this a little bit mysterious and mystifying. It's talking about a whole bunch of stuff about shrinking, expanding, etc. And then suddenly, somewhere in the middle, it's talking about fish. So where did that come from? What does it mean? And the overall meaning of the chapter, because of its brevity, can be a little bit hard to figure out. But that's exactly what we are going to do today, is to figure out the meaning completely, starting with the usual sectional analysis. And to do that, we look at the different lines to see if we can pick out repeating characters. And I can see that we have a very obvious repetition running up and down from 1 to 8. Can everyone see it? Pretty sure I am not the only one who can see it. So if you take a look at the last character of lines 1 through 8, I think you will also be able to see it, that these are all repeating characters. If you check against the translation, you can pretty easily figure out that the character is it. Now, of course, Chinese is contextual, so singular and plural depend on context, which means that it would also be okay to think of this character as them instead of it, if the context were plural. As it is, each one of these lines is non-specific in terms of what that it can be. This character zhi can also apply to people. So it's not just it or them, it can be him or her. It's by itself not singular or plural, nor is it gender specific. So are these the only repetitions that we see in these lines? Well, I hope you are able to see more. The same lines that we're talking about, it is easy to see, or should be easy to see, that there's a there's an A-B repetition. There's a repetition that jumps over lines, and that is the first two characters of each line. So I think you can see it also. If not, let me highlight them for you. So with these, you can see that these are highly repetitive lines. The only character that changes is the third character, and they mean all different things. Now here, I want to especially point out line 6 and line 8. Take a look at the third character in each one. So you may, at a glance, think that they are the same character. But if you look closely and compare, you will find that the middle of the character is slightly different. These are, in fact, different characters with different meaning. Hopefully everyone can see that. The third character in line 6 and the third character in line 8. So we'll talk about the meaning of these characters momentarily. Now let's determine the sectional breaks. So all of these repeating characters, it's pretty obvious they're all in one section. So is there any more to the section? Could we perhaps put a line between line 8 and line 9, a division between 8 and 9? Would that be where we put it? Turns out the answer is no, and it looks like this. So why is that? Well, it's because line 9 serves as a mini summary for the previous 8 lines. That the previous 8 lines, I'll talk about this particular concept, and line 9 gives that concept a name, subtle clarity. And there's a specific reason why it's called subtle clarity. Now, because of the A-B structure, the repeating structure that you see, it's also pretty easy to figure out that these 8 lines break down into 4 couplets, or 4 sets of 2 lines each. So lines 1 and 2, that's 1 point. 3 and 4 will be the second point. 5 and 6, the third point, and 7 and 8 will be the final point. So that's how you would divide it up that way. So now a quick challenge for those who are perceptive. Can you see any other repetition in this particular chapter? As we're looking at the second section, the section below, the concluding section, we can see that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of repeating characters, right? Now, if you take a closer look though, and allowing for some of the repetition being maybe offset by a character or 2, you will be able to see the highlighted repetition there. Hopefully everyone can see that. So line 11 and line 13 have 2 characters that are similar. And those 2 characters, 不可, are simply translated as cannot. In Mandarin, cannot is reversed syntactically. So the 2 characters, 不可, the first character there, 不, which is the first character of line 13, it means no or not. The second character, the character following that, 可, means can or able to. So when you want to say cannot in Mandarin, you actually effectively saying no can, which is similar to the no can do of our popular expression. So there we have it. We now have the 2 sections, and I think we are ready to delve into a line-by-line analysis in terms of meaning. So let's take a look. Let's start with the first part. Now, with the Daodejing, when you have a collection of 8, you can pretty much be sure that you can divide up the 8 into 2 parts of 4, and then the 4 into 2 parts of 2. So in our analysis, we will start by looking at the first 4 lines, as you can see. So then the very first thing that I want to do is to highlight the AB repeating characters, as you can see here, and then talk about what they mean to kind of set the stage. First, we have yu. So the pinyin is the yu, and I know most people, native English speakers, will look at that and say you, but it's a little bit different. It's yu, but then the yu is probably the closest that we can come to the actual Mandarin pronunciation. And the meaning of this character yu, usually associated with desiring something, wanting something, wishing for something. So that's certainly the context here. Now, if you were doing the translation yourself, instead of if one wishes to shrink it, you can always render it in alternative fashion as if you want to shrink it, and then continuing with you must first expand it. Now, it wouldn't be wrong per se to say if you desire to shrink it, but people don't usually talk like that. So wish or want will be the most appropriate translation here. If you wish to shrink it, if one wishes to shrink it, if you want to shrink it, if one wants to shrink it, etc. So that's this character. And this is the character that's repeated in 4 lines, 1, 3, 5, 7. Now let's take a look at the other repeated characters that's repeated as the first character of line 2, 4, 6, and 8. That's coming up. So this character is B, and the pinyin will be B-I. B, it's not pronounced bi. A lot of times we look at that and we might think, bilateral, bi-weekly. But in this case, it's B. Now, the meaning of B is must, like have to. You gotta, you must. So pretty simple and not too many different ways to translate that. So what about the other repeating characters? There's another one here, another one here. So they have to do with chronology, sequence, as in when you say if you want to shrink it and the character in front of it adds a future context to it, which means that you have to first expand, which is the second character here, giving it that context. Then after that, you will want to shrink it. So it's those characters are associated with the timing of events. What happens first, what happens after that, etc. Let's move on. There's more to talk about. So with both of those characters that we just talked about, the wanting something, desiring, wishing, and also the must, those characters are very much still in use in modern Mandarin. They are used all the time. But the next character to focus on, this is not commonly used today at all. The pinyin is xi, and the meaning is to shrink, as you can see here. Specifically, it's shrinking in the context of deflating, like making something smaller, as an example, by sucking all the air out of it. Shrinking a balloon, for instance. So that's the next bullet there. The meaning is to make something smaller, to deflate. So this is not a character that's commonly used in modern Mandarin. Hardly anyone, any Mandarin speaker would ever use something like this. They will use different expressions to talk about shrinking something. So in this ancient context, there's a specific meaning in regards to the deflation or shrinking or making smaller of something. In this ancient context, this character specifically points to deflating someone in terms of ego, position, reputation, prestige, and so on. Now, it could be more than just a person. It could be a thing. It could be a country, like a kingdom or an empire. So a kingdom or empire, just as an example, is certainly something that can either expand or shrink. And we'll use that as an example coming up. Now, here, when we apply it to a person, to deflate someone in terms of ego, position, etc., this is quite similar to our popular common expression to take someone down a peg or two, to humble someone, to make sure that they know that maybe they're not as great as they think they are, to take someone down a peg or two. So in the ancient context, very similar to our modern English expression. So let's move on. Now, with those character explanations out of the way, I think we're ready to tackle the meaning behind. We'll start with the first two lines. So here's how we'll proceed. We'll focus on these two lines. If one wishes to shrink it, one must first expand it. So translated from the original. Now you have heard the characters' explanations. So now you can see that this character means to wish for something, to want something. This character means to deflate, to make smaller. And then you have a must here, and then you have expand. So the meaning is clear, pretty clear. In order to shrink something, you have to first expand. Now let's talk about what that means. I'm going to isolate those characters down below and then focus on the explanation. So first of all, the ancient sages were observers and students of history. They know what has occurred in the past, and they learn from that. So one of the things that they note about the past, and here we're talking about ancient Chinese history. So even prior to the time of Lao Tzu, 2,500 years ago, China had already had 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years before that in its ancient history. During those 2,000 years, kingdoms and empires have come and gone. So these are all recorded, and the invention of the written language for ancient Chinese goes back many thousands of years. So there were many records available for students, historians such as Lao Tzu to study and learn from. So these ancient sages, they knew how a kingdom could go through changes. It could, for instance, expand in its territory by conquest, annexing other kingdoms to itself, making it a much larger kingdom, and eventually a powerful empire that gobbles up, absorbs all the neighboring kingdoms. This is definitely something that's happened quite a few times in ancient Chinese history that Lao Tzu studied. Now, these empires did not last. They would collapse. So what happened? Well, the sages learned from history and noted that the empire would disintegrate from within and eventually collapse. This was a cycle that repeated itself many times, and Lao Tzu was aware of this repetition throughout history. So he noted that we have expansion, strengthening, followed by shrinking, weakening. It happened so many times that it started to look like a pattern from his perspective. He could see that this was, maybe a principle, maybe a law of nature. This was a repeating pattern, and therefore it must be part of the Tao. Sort of like a natural law, but applied to everything, including, in this case, kingdoms and empires. So there's a little bit more to say about that. Let's continue. Now, those of you who have been listening to this talk, you already know that when we speak of the Tao, we always apply it at multiple levels. The level of the kingdom and empires is certainly one level, a cosmic level with astronomy, stars and planets, that's another valid level. But the most important level of all, because we're human beings living our human lives, the most important level to apply the Tao is actually at the human level, at the level where you and I operate. So not only were the ancient sages observers and students of history, they were also observers and students of human nature, human beings, human interactions, human behavior. And they could tell that there were equivalents between the different levels, that human beings could act in ways and go through changes similar to a kingdom, to empire, to disintegration. So they could see that an arrogant person or bully was similar to an expanding empire, seems powerful and strong, seems to gobble up other people. Now, because the sages study history, they could also anticipate that person's eventual downfall because they have seen it happen again and again with powerful empires throughout history. So they knew that this arrogant, very proud person becoming powerful is only a prequel to the eventual collapse, disintegration. So this is wisdom that applied in ancient times, but the ancient sages of ancient China were not the only ones who noted this. This is wisdom that were duly noted in the West as well. So I want to cite an example of similar wisdom from the West. This wisdom was not unique to the Tao. In the Bible, we also see pride goeth before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Book of Proverbs 16:18. So ancient sages, East and West, had noted the role that arrogance plays, whether on the part of an empire, proud of its accomplishments, or arrogance on the part of a person, thinking that he or she can do no wrong. They're all headed for a fall, all headed for destruction. So that's kind of what we're starting to get at here. In order to shrink something, you must first expand. If we apply that to the ego, then to expand is the expansion of the ego, and to shrink is the collapse and disintegration. causing that ego to shrink to very small size indeed. So by understanding this pattern, it gives us more tools and more strategies to approach situations in life. And I want to give you an example. If we were to apply this pattern to life, like the way that we interact with other people, there's an example of what can happen if you were to, let's just say you notice that someone else, a peer, maybe a coworker, maybe a friend, someone is getting quote unquote too big for his britches, or the head is swelling up too big, ego is getting out of control. So you perhaps wish to approach that person to let them know they need to tone it down. So that's what the bullet says here. It's an example of what can happen if you take the direct approach and tell a peer to tone down his or her ego. Well, you know you may get pushback. When you tell someone, listen, your ego is starting to get out of control, you might want to put some brakes on that. You may not have that person saying, oh, really? Well, gosh, thank you for telling me. I never would have known otherwise. You may not get that kind of gratitude or positive response. In fact, more likely than not, you can get the opposite, the pushback. For instance, there are several different ways that you can experience this pushback. It may be just that person not taking you seriously, not thinking that, wow, this is something I really need to watch. I need to be careful about this. No, this person may actually be rather dismissive. So you may get someone ignoring your advice, and you already know what that's going to sound like. Yeah. Okay, well, whatever, just whatever. Very dismissive. Not really listening, and you know that that what you have said hasn't really registered. So that person is definitely not going to be shrinking his or her ego based on your advice. They just ignore you. Another way that you can get pushback is with this, with a finger being pointed back at you. People get defensive. This is one of the most common strategies. Me? No, you're the one with a problem with a big ego. You're the one with the problem, not me. So a lot of times when people push back, they will use this strategy. Point the finger back on you. Me? No, not me. You. You got the problem. So that being the case, this person is certainly not going to be shrinking an overinflated ego. And then lastly, there's also gaslighting. Gaslighting is a relatively new term that became popular. It means to make someone question their perception. Like, no, you're crazy. Nobody else has a problem with me. You're just imagining things. You're seeing things that aren't really there. So the idea is to make you question your own judgment. So it's slightly different than having the finger being pointed back at you. So you get pushbacks in that way. So why do you get pushbacks like that when you try to tell another person to tone down the ego? Well, it's because of what we're going to talk about next. It's because the ego itself, when it is overinflated, it provides its own strongest defense. You've seen this, I've seen it. When the ego is out of control, the person feels that he or she can do no wrong. So when you try to take them down, a little bit, they will come back and defend that ego. Ego defends itself. And that's why the direct approach is unlikely to work. So when sages look at this kind of human interaction, Lao Tzu, with this particular set of 2 lines, is basically saying that, well, he understands human nature, he understands human pattern, so Lao Tzu says it would actually be more effective to do the opposite, to inflate that ego even more, rather than to try to take it down a notch or 2. The idea is to boost that ego even more. So this is not a kind thing to do. This is actually something that can lead to the other person's destruction. So even though this can be done, and this has oftentimes happened in real life, this is actually not a recommended strategy from the Tao. The idea is to know that this is a powerful way to go in manipulating people, but it's also something that's so negative, so destructive, you really shouldn't use it. Now, what if you were to inflate that ego even more? Well, what usually will happen is that this person, convinced of his or her own righteousness or superiority, will end up doing something incredibly foolish. And that brings the whole situation, it'll come crashing down. And when this happens, you can expect that the ego for this person will take a beating because of that whole disastrous failure. Indeed, the more public the failure, the more quickly the ego deflation will occur. So this is, again, I will keep referencing back East and West, because this is actually wisdom from wisdom traditions, both East and West. So this is also well known to Western sages of old. And we have common expressions reflecting that. So for instance, one common expression that we have is to say, give him enough rope and he will hang himself. That, if someone is already out of control, you give him more freedom of action, and that person by himself will act in such foolish ways as to bring about his own end. And it's a common expression because it's a common occurrence. It's something that can happen quite often, something that we can witness. Now, where does this idea come from in the Tao? In the West, when we say give him enough rope and he will hang himself, that's based on our observation of human interactions in society. With the Tao, the idea is actually based on nature. As with so many other things about the Tao, it's nature derived. So sages will look at nature and note that living things grow strong and then weaken with age, which we human beings are no exceptions. We're also living things that will grow strong and then weaken with age, just a matter of time. And if you look at plants, you definitely can notice how flowers bloom in spectacular fashion before they wither and die. So both animals and plants follow the same kind of pattern. Grow up, grow tall, grow bigger, grow stronger, and then reaching a peak of strength, and then starting to weaken with age. Flowers the same way, blooming beautifully, and then beginning the withering process. So it's a pattern that we can see out in nature. Now, as I previously mentioned, the sages also study human beings, human behavior, as well as ancient history, the coming and going with kingdoms and empires. So this is something, this idea is already something that covers history, sociology, psychology, and the animal kingdom, and also the world of plants, flowers. It seems to be everywhere. Indeed, we can say that the principle is something that applies to everything, no matter what that thing is. So everything in nature reaches an extreme and then reverses itself. It gets to a high level and then it starts coming down. And we say that as a common expression too. You know, that which goes up must come down. And it's not just living things. So, for instance, the day reaches its warmest temperature at around noontime, usually 1 p.m. or so, and then starts cooling off. Now, the reverse is also true. The night will reach its coldest temperature, you know, sometime around, I don't know, an early hour in the morning, and then it will slowly begin to warm up as it waits for the sunrise. So this is definitely an instance where we see natural manifestation like daylight following the same pattern as living things, even though daylight itself is not a living thing. And think about the tide. The tide reaches its highest point, you know, every month, and then begins to subside. High tide transitioning to low tide. And it's the same with weather. So for instance, storm reaches its peak strength and then starts to weaken. The rain that was coming down in buckets starts to weaken in strength so that it goes from this incredible downpour and begins to reduce in strength until it's a drizzle, and then it dries up, it stops. So this is something that happens in every aspect of nature, not just living things. So because this is so widespread, this is so prevalent, it's given rise to popular common expressions in Mandarin, and I want to introduce a couple of Mandarin expressions to you, explain what they mean. Common Mandarin expressions. So the observation from the sages is that it applies not just to nature, but also to our lives. Of course, you would have a valid point if you point out that our lives are part of nature also, and not apart from it. So here's the first common Mandarin expression that I wanted to share with you. 物极必反. Most of these set phrases in Mandarin are 成语. Set phrases usually come as a collection of 4 characters, sometimes more, but usually 4. So 物极必反. You see the pinyin in this particular slide. Let me explain. 物 means thing or things. 极, the second character, means extreme. 必, well, we looked at that character just a while ago. It means must. 反, last character, means reverse. So if you stitch them together without attempting to translate, you will get thing, extreme, must, reverse. And what it means is that when something, anything, reaches an extreme, it must reverse itself. Like pendulum motion is a good example. Now we see 物极必反 in human nature, in human society, human interactions. There's sometimes a tendency for humans to compensate for something, perhaps an injustice, and end up with overcorrection. Like you don't just reverse the mistake, but you tilt the balance to the other side. So 物极必反, that's one common expression. Here's another one. 乐极生悲. So pinyin 乐极生悲. What does that mean? Well, 乐 means happiness. 极, well, you've seen this in the first expression. It means extreme. So happiness, extreme. 生, to give birth to give rise to. 悲, the last character, means sadness, something tragic. So again, if you string them together without attempting to translate, you've got happiness extreme gives rise to sadness. What does it mean? When happiness reaches an extreme, it gives rise to sadness. So one example is a victory celebration that leads to drunk driving when you're trying to make your way home, and the drunk driving causes an accident. So the extreme happiness of the victory celebration is what leads to the tragic accident, hence sadness. Yet another pattern in life. So that's what we talk about in the Tao. We're observing, noting patterns, and starting to learn from them. So those are the expressions that I wanted to share. Let's continue on. So now, line 3 and 4. If one wishes to weaken it, one must first strengthen it. So this is very similar to 1 and 2, to shrink, expand. Usually we think of shrinking as a weakening, a reducing, and expanding as a strengthening process. You know, expanding, getting bigger and more powerful. So in a similar way, and using the same principle from nature, Lao Tzu is saying that the way to weaken something is not to fight it, because to fight it is just pitting strength and strength in a battle of attrition, like force against force, strength against strength. And it's a mutual reduction. If you were to fight someone, you end up getting hurt too. So even if you defeat that person, you've already, taken some injuries. In the clash of two armies, even the side that wins suffers casualties. So fighting fire with fire is usually not a good idea from the attacker's point of view, the attacker's perspective. So instead of that, Lao Tzu says, in order to weaken something, you should do the opposite. You should make it stronger. Now, with this, most people will look at this idea and say, what? That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. It seems to be totally going against common sense. If I want to weaken something, why would I give it more strength? So it actually is not a paradox. Sometimes, authors who don't really know the Tao will take something they can't understand completely and call it a Tao paradox, or maybe something that's not meant to be understood. That's what they'll say. Sort of like a Zen paradox. However, usually all it really means is that they haven't figured out what it really means yet. So Tao came way before the Zen, and the lessons of the Tao, even when they're not obvious, even when they're not intuitively appealing, they really actually do work. So this can also work in real life, as I would like to illustrate by sharing a story with you. So the story is this one here. The name of the story is Weaken and Strengthen. As you listen to the story, I think you will find that an equally good title would be strengthened and weakened with the sequence reversed. The image that you see here is a newscast, television newscast studio. So this is the anchor chair where the cameras will zoom in close to the news anchor to hear the news anchor report the news. So many of the stories that I share with everyone are from ancient origins. So this is an exception. This is a story in modern times about a reporter, an anchorman who is at a news station. So as our story opens, the latest ratings came in for the newscast. And the anchor, his name is Anthony, that newscast that he anchors once again ranks first. So this, of course, is cause for celebration because once again, this anchor, Anthony, was the #1 news anchor among all the TV journalists. So, of course, Anthony the anchor was very popular. Not only was he popular, he had also developed quite a bit as a star, along with a star-sized ego. And that ego constantly brought him into conflict with others on set at the studio, including his boss, and his boss is the news director. So one clash that occurred recently between Anthony the anchor and his boss, the news director, was when the television company president had a son who graduated from college. So the news director, wishing to please his boss, the company president, sent a news reporting team to cover the graduation ceremony for the son. When the newsman returned with the story, Anthony, the anchor, refused to report it in his show. He refused because he felt that this was simply not a newsworthy event. And he stood his ground. He said, how can this be newsworthy? And if we think of this as newsworthy, then what about graduation ceremony from all the other colleges? Right? So we can't report this. So he made his point. And because of his star-sized prima donna ego, he didn't stop at just making the point. He also threw in a whole bunch of remarks, unflattering remarks about the news director, his boss, and the company president, his boss's boss. So, of course, other people heard about this and quickly spread it far and wide on the company grapevine. People love to dish dirt, and they caught on to this. So they repeated what he said throughout the organization. Now, this was there was other clashes also, not just this one. There were times when his boss, the news director, wanted to de-emphasize some stories, not just report on something like a college graduation, but to hold on some of the stories without reporting it. But Anthony the anchor would insist on reporting them and would go against his boss and spend actually quite a bit of time on the air at the expense of other news items. And he would justify himself by saying that, well, people have a right to know. This is important. So this kind of insubordination happened so much that the president finally told the news director, you should just fire him. Just, I can't tolerate this kind of insubordination. I don't care how popular he is. Now, the news director said, no. Listen, Have you ever seen the volume of fan mail that he gets? I'll tell you, if I fire him, there's going to be such an outcry. There's going to be protests. There's going to be a mail campaign to bring him back. There's going to be such unhappy viewers that I'm probably going to have to resign as well. So you won't just be getting rid of him, you're also going to be getting rid of me. So the company president backed off. Or did he? The next day, Anthony, the anchor, was called into the president's office. So he thought maybe he was in trouble, but he wasn't that worried because he was backed by his high popularity rating. He figured, well, I probably get a reprimand over the recent careless remarks that I made, but it's no big deal. As long as my ratings are at an all-time high, I can get away with it. I can challenge management. They can't do anything to me. They wouldn't dare. So the conversation in the president's office surprised him. The president said, Anthony, you know, we've been talking about creating a new department for quite some time now. You know, it's a department for news documentaries. You've been excited about this. You've been thinking about this for a very long time, and you're also the best we have. So I think it only makes sense that we create this department and have you take charge of it. So Anthony is like, what? This is amazing. So excitement overwhelmed Anthony because if all went well, he could even leverage the news documentaries into a news magazine show. He could not believe what he was hearing. He came in expecting reprimand, but his dream job just landed in his lap. So news of this also spread quickly throughout the entire news organization, and his co-workers could not believe it either. They were stunned. Now, one of them expressed actually admiration for the president. He said, you guys can see that the president didn't take Anthony's crap personally, right? He did not retaliate. He actually, instead of doing that, he's actually promoting Anthony to Anthony's dream job. That's some class, man. That shows that he's a real professional, doesn't let personal feelings get in the way. So actually express a lot of admiration for the big boss. So in the new department, Anthony's first assignment was to create a documentary, and the subject was about the economy of the Pacific Rim, something that he was passionate about for quite some time. So the news station sent him on a 3-month investigative journey throughout the Pacific Rim to gather information, to get the material to put together the eventual broadcast. So Anthony traveled in style. He was on a generous expense account. After 3 months, he came back with a lot of stuff. He kept super busy during all that time, the 3 months, so he came back with boxes full of research material, a ton of notes that he took, a ton of paragraphs that he took, and a lot of tape recordings that he took. He felt that he was ready to make a difference. He felt like he was ready for the next stage in his career. He wanted to show everyone what he could do. He couldn't wait. He was so eager. But then he ran into his first snag. In order to put together his program, the documentary, he had to get stock footage from the news department. You know, his narrative would talk about how the economy used to be, and then showing stock footage from a long time ago, and then how things are today. So the news director, his old boss, was not exactly all that eager to help him. He said, just follow company procedures, fill out the appropriate forms like everybody else does. We all have to follow the same process. This became an exercise in frustration for Anthony. The simplest request took a long time. And when the film clips, when the stock footage did show up, those film clips, either they weren't located, they could not be located, or they were unusable. And the ones that they couldn't find, some of them, Anthony was pretty sure, yeah, I saw them, I've seen them, they're there. So he suspected that maybe people were sabotaging him intentionally, either making things more difficult or not helping at all. But he was not able to prove anything. So several more months passed, and his feature documentary was still far from completion. This meant that there was the beginning of criticism from the board of directors. After all, he used to be their star anchor, so he was one of their highest salary earners. All that money, and for what? So the question from the board became more pointed. Like, we spent all this money, and what's the end result? Well, so far, nothing. So finally, the president called Anthony in again and delivered the bad news to Anthony. He said, your heart's in the right place, Anthony, but this is just not working out. It's not working out for you. It's not working out for us. The board has decided to dismantle your department. So we only just created it, but it hasn't produced anything. So the board doesn't feel like there's a reason for the department to continue on. So listen, Anthony, perhaps you should consider going back to reporting rather than doing documentaries. Now, Anthony, after months and months of frustration, has had it with the plan of creating the documentary. So he said, yeah, that's just fine. That's fine with me. He said, after all, you know, and everybody knows that anchoring the news is what I do best. I'm a proven performer, and I know that I can return to it and shine like I did before. So yeah, put me back on the anchor desk. I'm ready. The president said, no, we can't do that. We can't do that right away. When you left on your 3-month trip to collect material for the documentary, we had to promote another anchor. So the new anchor is actually doing quite well. The audience got used to him, and now they are giving us great ratings. Again, they're comparable to what you did before. So this means you're going to have to go back to field reporting, but just for now. When the opportunity comes up to promote you, talk to the news director, your old boss, going to be your boss again, and we'll see what he can do for you. So, checkmate. Anthony was stuck. He had nowhere to go. He didn't want to go back to field reporting. He had to quit. He knew the news director would never let him anchor again when he's got the choice of someone else who is much more compliant with his wishes. So he couldn't bear the thought of going back to being a field reporter because he used to be the star. He had to quit. There was no two ways about it. So news of his departure spread throughout the small world of newscasters. Because of the manner in which he left, under such a dark cloud of failure, he was unfortunately not in a position to pick and choose from many job offers for his next job, and he had a very tough time landing his next gig. The end. So that's a rather modern story about a news anchor. So what's it got to do with this particular chapter? Well, it turns out quite a bit. Part of it, I think, is obvious. We talked about pride goeth before the fall. So definitely, Anthony's ego got out of control, led to his downfall. He might have thought that he was protected by his popularity, but he was wrong. He might have thought of himself as being indispensable. Well, he was wrong about that too. So here's the Tao associated with the story. Let's think about the TV anchor's boss, and here I mean the president, who technically is the boss's boss. First of all, he expanded Anthony's ego by promoting him. He strengthened Anthony's position by placing him in charge of his own department for news documentaries. So this is exactly as we have just talked about, that to shrink something, you have to expand. To weaken something, you have to strengthen. So that's what he did. Now, by the end of the story, what we see is that Anthony's ego was much deflated by the events. He lost his position as the star anchor. He had to be feeling pretty horrible about the prospects of going back to field reporting. So his ego was deflated, his position was weakened. So we can tell, it's quite true from this particular story, that to shrink something or someone, first expand. To weaken something or someone, first strengthen. It really does work. And there's a little bit more to it. This whole idea is not just in the realm of careers, promotion, demotion, firing, losing a job, looking for a job, all that stuff. This whole idea of expanding and then shrinking, strengthening and then weakening turns out to be so incredibly common, no matter where you look. So when we look at television, but not the newscast, but entertainment programs, there are many tropes that are used in television shows. What is a trope? It's a cliche, an overused formula, something that is repeated with variations again and again and again. So just as an example, the other day, I was talking to some friends and I said, well, imagine you are a modern woman living in the city. You are successful. You have a great job. You love your job. And you are so busy with your job that you don't have time for a social life. And then one day, you have to go back home, which is a small town. So you go back home only to discover that your high school flame is still single. At this point, my friends stopped me and said, wait a minute, we've seen that movie before. And I said, of course, I was describing a trope, a formula, something that is used over and over again. So there are many tropes like that. There's one particular one that bears upon our topic today. And that trope is called, gonna give them more energy. This is used all the time. As soon as I describe the overall pattern, you're gonna recognize it. In this pattern, we have a monster. The monster is on the loose, on a destructive rampage. So the good guys try to stop the monster. They blast at it, energy blast. But the monster shrugs them off, and it doesn't weaken with the blast. It actually seems to grow stronger with each blast. How can that be? How do we defeat the monsters? It's taking our best shots and it's getting stronger. What to do? What to do? Well, I think you can guess because you've seen this many times. Suddenly, the hero has an idea. We'll give it even more energy. And everybody is like, no, we can't do that. You're crazy. All of his teammates think he's crazy, but eventually he convinces them. He wins them over. They work together as a team against the monster, everybody pouring energy in. So the monster absorbs all that energy from all of them, seems to get even more powerful, seems to get even bigger, but soon realizes, no, there's too much to contain, can't take any more. So then the monster blows up. Once again, the good guys save the day. And you should be like, wait a minute. I've seen that. I've seen that cartoon or television show or movie. I've seen that quite a few times. That's a trope. And that's exactly why we're talking about this, because why do tropes, become a trope? It's because they are drawn from human experience. They're dramatic formulas that are often repeated with variations precisely because they're drawn from human experience. And so it means that we can see it not just in fiction, like television shows, cartoons, movies, or the story that we were just telling about the news anchor. And I remember the movie, The Incredible Hulk, directed by director Ang Lee, actually ended exactly the same way as what I just described to you. So sorry for the spoiler if you haven't seen that movie yet, but the point is, it's repeated so incredibly often because we have that in real life. We have examples in real life. Oftentimes, it can take the form of someone being promoted beyond his or her abilities, which causes problems for the organization and fellow employees. So in that example, the monster would be the bad manager. So the manager does well at a particular job, gets promoted, does well again, gets promoted again, and the promotion is the energy blast that causes the monster to grow bigger and bigger until the manager can no longer function at a competent level, promoted high enough to a level where he can no longer be doing as well as he did before, and then he will then cause problems for the organization and fellow employees, or in the case of our pattern, the monster blows up. This is in fact a common occurrence. There's a book written about it called The Peter Principle by Dr. Lawrence J. Peter. He phrased it this way. It's actually the Tao he's talking about, but he phrases it for modern business. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his level of incompetence. So it's the expansion and strengthening of this employee who becomes a manager, and then middle manager, senior manager, etc., until he just can't cope anymore. So that's the reason why I say that the story is called Weaken and Strengthen, but it can just as easily go by the reverse title, Strengthen and Weaken, as you can see. So if you understand this whole idea, this concept, it's time to challenge yourself to make use of it, to make your life better. So we have seen that energy infusion causes destruction. Okay, that's one way to put it. Here's a challenge question, which I want to answer by the end of our time together today. Challenge question. Can you see how you would use this Tao teaching to strengthen yourself naturally without collapsing in failure. See, that's pretty useful, and that's there too. On the surface, this Tao appears to be talking about how you can bring something to ruin, destruction, and collapse. But the reverse is also true. You can use this Tao, if you understand it, if you really have figured it out, you can understand how to make it so that you will expand and strengthen without the failure part. All right, so let's continue with our discussion. Much more to talk about still. We're now, as you can see, onto line 5. Line 5 and line 6 are together. And they say, if one wishes to discard it, one must first promote it. So what I'll point out is that we have now left the overall idea of shrinking, weakening versus expanding, strengthening. So now we're talking about something a little bit different, but the Tao applies just as well. So think about how these two lines apply to the story that you just heard. If one wishes to discard the arrogant anchor, one must first promote the arrogant anchor. So here's the bullet. In the story, we saw how the boss discarded the star anchor by first promoting him. Now, this is not the only way that we can apply these two lines. When we talk about promoting something, it's not just to elevate someone's level in an organization. To promote something can be taken as to market it, to promote in terms of advertising campaign, spreading the word. The character Xing can be something about making it grand, making it big, and then discard. Well, it is something that we can apply to fads. A particular fad will come along, gets promoted, gets a marketing push, for some reason becomes all the rage, and then at some point the buzz dies down. The fad is soon forgotten and discarded. So people no longer recall how big of a deal it used to be. So what are some examples? Well, here's one. This is a Tamagotchi. What is it? Well, a lot of people don't even remember this anymore. But this is an electronic digital pet. And you may be thinking, what? Digital pet, what is that? Yeah, the screen shows the representation of a little creature. So you can press a button to feed them, to give it some attention, and you can be pretty occupied keeping your pet happy and well fed. So this was a big deal for quite some time. Millions got sold, and then the buzz dies down. It is then discarded. Today, I don't know of anyone who has the Tamagotchi digital pet. And people liked it because of the novelty at the time, because of, something had gone viral back in those days. But now, hardly anyone even remembers or cares about the Tamagotchi. So definitely has been discarded in the dustbins of history. People liked it. People used to like it, I remember, because they didn't have to take care of the electronic digital pet like they would an actual real pet. A pet that's a biological entity like a dog or cat. There's quite a bit of work that you need to do to take care of a pet like that. So with this, that was not necessary. Now, before the Tamagotchi, there was another fad that is also forgotten, but has sold millions of units when it was big, but today hardly anyone remembers. And that is pet rocks. with the pet rocks, the whole idea seems similar, except the pet rocks don't even require anything. No button presses, nothing at all. It's just there. It's a rock with a couple of googly eyes on it. And, this made the inventor of pet rocks a millionaire, actually. And then people forget all about it because the fad has come and gone. So you can probably think of a whole bunch of other fads as well. There's a dance craze that comes and goes. The twist, people used to do that. Of course, nowadays we have other dance crazes. There used to be the YMCA that probably one day most people will also forget. So that is the nature of fads. They come and go. They don't last. So they get promoted heavily and then they get discarded. Seems to be the way of the world. Next, let's take a look at lines 7 and 8. If one wishes to seize it, one must first give it. I'm going to start by focusing on this character, 取. The pinyin is QU, but it sounds more like 取 with a CH sound. And then the meaning for that is to take, to get, to obtain. Now, as you can see in the translation, I've chosen the word seize. And that's because that is the context that the Daodejing commentaries made very clear was the original meaning. However, we can definitely use seize and the other explanations, the other definitions, to give it a broader meaning. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, in order to receive kindness, you have to first give kindness. So this has sort of a karmic flavor to it. It's like karma. You want to receive something, you have to be ready to give it, and you have to be the first to give it before you can receive it. So now let's take a look at the two lines. So how did karma contribute to the story that we just heard? In the story, we definitely saw traces of karma. The star anchor, Anthony, did not treat his boss very well. He was insubordinate. So his boss, the news director, also did not treat him all that well when he needed the help. We saw karma contributed to the anchor's downfall. Others were unhelpful because he had treated them poorly in the past. So this is also a common pattern in life, something that we in the West also have a common popular expression for. I think you may recognize this expression, although you may not know the source. Here's what it is. It's from Wilson Mizner, a playwright. Back in the 1930s, he said, "Be kind to everyone on the way up. You'll meet the same people on the way down." So true. So if you think about it, Anthony the anchor could have done much better by heeding this advice. On his way up to the top of the charts, to the ratings charts, to become the star anchor with the most viewership, if he was kind to everyone on his way there, he can count on a lot more help on his way down. But he didn't, and that was a mistake. So with this in mind, with this pattern totally understood, the wise cultivator of the Tao works backwards. That is, first you figure out what you want in life, what you want to get. Then you take the initiative to give it to other people first, in anticipation that karma will bring it all back to you. So this is one way to extract something useful and positive out of this particular story. So now we're talking about lines 7 and 8, and these are different ways to see the Tao in the world. So you can tell that there's karma, interactions, by the way you treat other people, the way they treat you back. There's more. So I want to give everyone a flavor for how the original meaning can sometimes be pretty hard to translate into English, and how the original can be applied in different ways. So when we talk about shrinking, expanding, strengthening, weakening, the example that I used was like expanding a balloon, shrinking the balloon when the air goes out of it, strengthening, like, living things becoming strong and then weak because of age. Well, yes, those are all great ways to see that particular line, that in order to shrink, you must first expand. But there's more. So when the ancient sages talk about this, they were thinking in very generic ways, underlying principles throughout reality. So one of the examples that they use, that they list for shrinking and expanding, is the process of folding a blanket. That you want to fold the blanket to reduce its, to store it, to put it away in storage. So you're shrinking it. You're shrinking the amount of space that it takes up. But in order to do that, you have to spread it out. You have to expand it and then start folding it. So that's an example that in order to shrink, quote unquote, a blanket, it doesn't actually get smaller. It just takes less space. First, you have to expand. So here's another one. To discard, to promote, and as I mentioned, the character for promote can be the character to make it really light up in a blaze of glory. So when you say if you wish to discard it, you must first promote it. The promote is a limited word to translate a concept that's actually more generic, more general. So one example is that to dispose of trash, which is to discard, is by gathering it together and burning it. To promote it, to fire it up. So if you think about it, when we talk about promotion in terms of marketing in the West, we also talk about getting fired up. So the linguistic differences is not dramatic. They're just not used in the same way across the linguistic divide. And then one last way to see the world through the Tao. That if you think about, and this is the line that says, if you wish to seize it, you must first give it. So the example being used here is about fishing. And what's fishing got to do with it? Well, in order to seize the fish, which is to catch the fish in fishing, first you have to provide it with bait. That is, you have to give it something, which is the bait. So these are many numerous different ways to see the Tao, or see the world through the Tao. And I also want to provide yet another example about if you want to shrink it, you must first expand it. Then, so the only thing you need to be mindful of is what are you expanding and what are you shrinking. So they can be related. So for this example, I want to share with everyone a story from Aesop's fable. It's called The Fox and the Crow. In this fable, once upon a time, the fox was going through the woods in search of food, looking all around, finding some kind of food somewhere, just looking and feeling hungry. At one point, the fox saw a crow just on the limb of a tree. Now, the fox has seen crows before. That was not remarkable. What really caught the fox's attention and made him stop for a second look was that the crow had a piece of cheese held in her beak that the crow was about to consume and enjoy. So the fox thought, well, I don't have to continue searching for food. I'll just figure out a way to get that for myself, for my breakfast. So he trotted up to the foot of the tree where the crow was sitting. He looked up to the crow and he said, "Good morning, beautiful creature." So the crow is no dummy. Her head cocked to one side, watched the fox with a lot of suspicion. She kept her beak tightly closed on the cheese and did not return his greeting. So the fox said, "Wow, what a charming creature she is. This crow is so incredibly beautiful. Her feathers shine. What splendid wings. What a wonderful bird. Now, it would be amazing if such a beautiful bird also has a beautiful voice. Everything else about her is already so perfect. But she probably can't sing. Her voice is probably awful, because if her voice is good, based on everything else, it would just be too unfair. I would need to hail her as the queen of birds." So listening to the flattering words, the crow forgot all about her suspicions. The crow was thinking, my voice is pretty decent. I can sing. I can belt out a tune. Of course, my voice is as beautiful as the rest of me. And I want to be the queen of birds. So she opened her beak wide to utter her loudest call, and the cheese fell down straight into the waiting fox, who snatched it up and was able to have his breakfast. "Thank you," said the fox to the crow. He walked off and he said, "Yeah, sorry, I said you probably don't have a voice. You do have a voice, but where are your wits?" The end. So this is a story that actually goes back. The original was in Greek and Latin from the 1st century current era, or around the beginning of that time. So this is maybe something that came after the time of Lao Tzu by several centuries. And what it shows is quite clear, that an effective strategy has to do with flattery, to butter someone up or to expand someone's ego. So as you can see, what happened here, in appealing to the ego, causing the crow to open up her beak, causing the cheese to drop out, losing that cheese. So what the fox has done is to use the first strategy from this particular chapter, expanding the ego of the crow, and then causing the ego to shrink in the sense of losing her breakfast to the fox. So the Tao cultivator understands how this works and knows that it's effective. And yet, at the same time though, I want everyone to notice that the fox is not representative of Tao cultivators, even though Tao sages and cultivators understand the effectiveness of flattery. They keep that knowledge primarily for self-defense. They would not be utilizing that knowledge to gain advantage over other people, to take advantage of other people. So that's the difference. But still, you can see the process is clear. When you expand someone's ego, that leads to some sort of shrinkage. And that is the story of the fox and the crow. Now let's continue talking about the rest of the chapter. So in line 9, this is called subtle clarity. So I want to talk about exactly what it means to call something subtle clarity. First, we can begin by looking at this expression, this line, character by character. First, with the pinyin, the way this sounds is 是谓微明. So the pinyin is exactly as you see here, 是谓微明. You may think the second and third characters sound the same because they're spelled the same in pinyin, but they are at a different pitch. So the second character is wei. That's the fourth pitch. And then the third character is wei, which is the second pitch. So to a Mandarin speaker, they would sound completely different. And they would know that it's a completely different character with a different meaning. So the literal translation, if we were to transcribe these characters one by one, so the literal transcription would be first character is, second character called, and then wei, it means minor, imperceptible, insignificant, subtle. And then the last one, clarity. So this is called imperceptible clarity, or insignificant clarity, or too small to notice clarity. That's the whole idea. Now, why is it called that? Well, it's because with these strategies, Lao Tzu knew that they would not be readily understood or accepted. Each one of the four couplets, they all contain profound wisdom, but they all seem to be the opposite of something obvious. For instance, if you want to weaken something, most people would not think that you need to strengthen it first and then let it weaken itself. People would try very hard just to weaken directly rather than this roundabout way of giving someone more rope. So there's a little bit more to this explanation. Let me direct your attention to that. Most of the time, when you think about doing the opposite of what is obvious, to expand instead of shrink, strengthen instead of weaken, promote instead of discard, give instead of seize, pardon me, what it means is that, first of all, just like the president in our story, he appeared to give in to the news anchor and gave him his promotion. So if you were to try to do the opposite, you may appear to yield or give in to your opposition. Well, a lot of people don't like that. They want to be more confrontational. They are looking to clash rather than this indirect approach. And the second thing is that you have to think in terms of long-term strategy. You have to think in terms of what is not the benefit that is not being realized today, but will be realized tomorrow. Now, people don't think that way. They usually prefer immediate gratification, the quick payoff. So for these two reasons, a lot of people will not easily understand what we're talking about here today. Instead, they will prefer to be confrontational and direct. They want something quick. So the typical approach that we see in the world is that when people see strength, force, they will try to meet it with force of their own. This is sort of the fight fire with fire type of approach. And it usually does not end well. In line 10, it says, the soft and weak overcomes the tough and strong. So this is a central idea in the Tao. We see this all the time. This is the reason why when we talk about expand in order to shrink, weaken in order to strengthen, well, the opposite of that is to try to overcome the tough and strong with tougher and stronger. And that's not a great idea because you're going to suffer injuries. So rather than to meet force with force, in the Tao, it's better to follow nature and let the soft overcome the hard. So let's talk about the ways that this manifests in different aspects of life. When we talk about nature, for the soft to overcome the hard, this is seen in water dissolving hard rocks. Also, oftentimes, Tao sages will talk about how dripping water over time will drill through hard rocks. Tao sages will also talk about how your tongue will survive far longer than your teeth because the soft overcomes the hard. And certainly in nature, to be soft and pliant means that you are alive. To be hard and brittle means you are dead. So that's another way that soft overcomes the hard. In the story that we share today, the boss appearing to yield by giving the anchor his dream job, that's really the soft approach. But as you have heard, it's very effective. If you practice Tai Chi, then you know that it's a move, you know about a move that draws your opponent further along his striking trajectory to make him lose his balance and stumble. So rather than to meet his strike with a strike of your own, probably hurting both of you in the process, the better way in Tai Chi is to go with the motion that is already in play and to bring that motion further than was originally intended. And that's where the loss of balance occurs. That, again, is the soft overcoming the hard. And there's a little bit more. In military strategy, especially in ancient China, the soft overcomes the hard can be seen when an army is lured into a trap, into a kill zone that's been carefully set up with an ambush in hiding. So the army, the attacking army, may be thinking that it's chasing a smaller, weaker force into a canyon, but then suddenly finds itself surrounded on all sides with its exit cut off, and then fit only for slaughter. That again is an example of soft overcoming the hard, not head to head army against army, a head-on collision, that is never the way of the Tao. It's only the way of superhero movies, not the Tao. So for the military, luring the enemy force into a well-planned ambush. So overall, what we're looking at is the whole thing, this entire chapter is basically Lao Tzu revealing these subtle strategies. You know, he calls them subtle clarity. They are really kind of subtle because a lot of people don't get it. These subtle strategies that many people would not understand. He's trying to make us aware. So one purpose is awareness. We will recognize these strategies when they're used against us. So this means to know that these strategies work. For instance, flattery. Flattery will get you anywhere. So we would recognize these strategies when they're used against us, or in other words, we can be protected from these strategies. Therefore, knowing these strategies means, as an example, that you realize when someone is trying to use flattery on you to gain some sort of advantage. So I hope that makes sense. Another purpose that Lao Tzu had was that he understands how destructive these strategies can be. So, for instance, the fox and the crow, you know, using flattery to gain an advantage and then causing the crow to lose her breakfast. So that's the win-lose paradigm, whereas in the Tao, it's really more of a win-win. To use these strategies against other people can be very negative. They can be used to benefit you, but to negatively impact others. In other words, you benefit at their expense. So Lao Tzu would prefer that we not use these strategies for that. So he's going to spend the next 3 lines talking about how we should not utilize these strategies. We should just be aware of them. We should just know about them. And this is where we come to line 11. Line 11, as I mentioned before, seems to come out of nowhere. Suddenly, we have a reference to fish. Fish did not come up before in previous lines. Suddenly, it's there. What is that all about? Well, it turns out that fish is being used here in metaphorical fashion. This line is purely metaphorical. So fish in this case represents those very effective but underhanded strategies that we have talked about, i.e., flattery will get you everywhere. So what Lao Tzu is saying is that fish cannot leave the depths. The fish that is swimming in the depths, it means you are keeping these strategies buried or, deep underwater. So they're kept as dark arts, recognized as dangerous in that it can do harm to other people. It can be detrimental to other people, whereas the Tao is all about serving other people. So when we say they cannot leave the depths, what we're really saying is don't weaponize these strategies against those people who don't understand them and therefore are easy prey, because the Tao is meant to be used in a positive and beneficial way. So I find it interesting to study these strategies and understand and figure out what can be done with them, and then have that knowledge for defensive purposes only, rather than to exploit other people. People who don't understand the Tao, who don't understand how these strategies work, they have weaknesses that can be exploited, and I won't do that. Then we have line 12, which is about the sharp instruments of the state. Now, it may not look it, but this is actually another way to express the same sentiment as line 11. when we talk about the sharp instruments of the state, the sharp instruments are like the fish that swim in the depths. They should be kept hidden, out of view, out of sight. So when fish leave the depths, they become exposed, they can be seen. So when the sharp instruments are displayed, they can be seen. That's the parallel. So what Lao Tzu is trying to do here is to make his warning more literal. And he's repeating himself for emphasis. The sharp instruments are the potentially destructive strategies or the fish in the depths. Now, one of the levels that Lao Tzu speaks to is the level of the kingdom or the state, the country, the empire. So Lao Tzu was aware that those who study these strategies, they have the ability to apply these sharp instruments, these weapons, to the level of conquests and warfare. Of course, if they did do that, then ironically, they will expand and strengthen the kingdom and take it on a path of ruin, because what follows the expansion and strengthening is the shrinking and the weakening. So the ministers advising the king or the emperor, for them, the goal is the same. What Lao Tzu advises, suggests, is the same. And Lao Tzu would say, well, you should know these strategies, you should understand them, but don't use them. Don't use them for conquest. Don't use them for warfare. That would just cause a tremendous amount of harm. And now let's go to the last line. So to not show the sharp instruments to the people is the same as saying, hey, don't let the fish leave the depths. When the fish are swimming in the depths, they cannot be seen. When the sharp instruments are being kept by the state, they cannot be seen. When the fish come out, they can be seen. When you put the sharp instruments on display, they can be seen. And to be in possession of these sharp instruments, or to have the fish swimming in the depths, that just means you understand how the pattern works, how the Tao works. You have the ability to put it to use if you have to, but you know you really shouldn't. And also, as we have talked about, with the karma as an example, there's a way to use these skills in a very constructive and positive way. That it doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be destructive. So note the real understanding of this teaching will also let you use it skillfully in a constructive rather than destructive way. So I'll run through a quick example, a couple of examples, and then we'll do the summary for today. I'm happy to see that we have made our way to the last line so we can have a summary that really makes sense. So there's a couple of ways that we can use this teaching for positive benefits in your life. Number one is to let karma work for you. For all the good things you would like to receive from other people, begin a regular practice to give it to others first. So for instance, if you want to get attention from people, you must be first willing to pay attention to them. Now, I do see many people who would like to get attention from others, but are not willing to pay attention to others. So the bottom line there is that people don't really care what you know until they know that you care. So that's the first of the two suggestions. Number two, to naturally expand and strengthen your position in a positive way, you can start by shrinking and weakening your ego. What that means is that you want to get yourself into a humble state of mind so that you'll be willing to learn from all different sources, and this will naturally put you in a position for promotion and advancement, and it's done in a Tao-centric and natural way so that you get to avoid the destructive effects of this strategy. Do keep in mind, we're talking about long-term strategies here, so the above will not change anything overnight. But definitely, they do produce real, lasting results in the long run. So that's the line by line for chapter 36. Our timing is excellent. We're just in time for the summary. So there are several more thoughts that I wanted to share with the group on applying today's idea to life. Number one, this chapter emphasizes the soft overcoming the hard. So if you were to encounter a domineering bully, whether at school or at work, whatever the setting may be, the better way is not to fight the bully. The better way is to withdraw from conflict. Give them more rope. Observe and learn, and see the effectiveness of the Tao being demonstrated. So that's suggestion number one. Here's number two. Whatever you put out in life, whether it's good or bad, positive or negative, will come back at you sooner or later because karma. So in anticipation of this, make sure you are dishing something out that you will enjoy taking when you are at the receiving end. So if you don't think that you will enjoy being at the receiving end of anger, make sure you are not dishing out anger to other people. And lastly, finally, I am noticing that in popular culture recently, there seems to be a lot of movies and television shows about comic book superheroes and supervillains. So I want to use that as an example and say that it's typically the case that toward the end, the supervillain, upon having the superheroes at his mercy, will gloat and maybe talk about his master plan, and will be doing the evil laugh, will be like, you now are powerless to stop me from doing XYZ. So the gloating before being defeated at the end of the show, well, that's a pretty good example of expanding and then shrinking, strengthening and then weakening. So I want to suggest we can all learn from that. If you learn from that example, you will know that the gloating should only be done after you have completed your master plan. Once your master plan is a done deal, signed, sealed, delivered, then feel free to gloat, but not before that. So don't be the supervillain. That is my message for everyone today. Now,
our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.